first commission we can start with is the Planning Commission. And most of the towns, I would say all of the towns in Connecticut, have a Planning Commission. Sometimes these are obviously combined with Zoning Commission, but we are going to talk strictly on Planning Commission. And the first thing I'd want to talk about is really this concept of the planning process. Since this is a Planning Commission, it must have something to do with planning. And there's a way that we do planning, particularly land use planning. Now, there's a lot of complex ways of approaching it, and you can find these flowcharts and all these different ways of approaching it, and it can be really quite complex. And this is obviously people like myself went to school to do planning, because there's all sorts of schools of thought of how you approach it and ways of going at it. But when it comes right down to it, the planning process is fairly simple, and really it begins first with knowing what you have in a community, doing some sort of inventory and understanding what is out there and what exactly you have. And this in terms of natural resources, cultural resources, and economic resources as well, and human resources even. So there are a lot of things that can go into an inventory. So this is oftentimes just a step of taking stock of what we have in the community. Now, as you start to do that, you start to see patterns sometimes in this information. You might see patterns in the natural resource or the physical resources of your town, and see how they relate to each other. And this sort of ability of starting to match up patterns and identify patterns in your community is really an idea of doing analysis. And the analysis sort of tries to both simplify your inventory and try to find meaning from your inventory that might help inform the next step, which is actually coming up with specific goals and objectives that you want to accomplish in the future. And this is really the planning step. And this is where you're taking the inventory and your analyses and coming up with goals and asking questions. And this might be an iterative step. You may come through that process, get to the plan, and realize, oh, hang on, we need to go back to the inventory, either get other information or analyze it differently to come up with these other sets of goals and objectives we need to do in the plan. So this is all rather iterative, but essentially this sort of flows from the inventory, the analysis, to the plan. And then finally, you need to try to not just write things down in some sort of plan, but you want to actually do something. And this is called the implementation step. And all planning should lead to some sort of implementation step. So something you can do. So you can lay down in plain black and white English and say, we are going, because of these goals and objectives, we're going to do this. And the implementation can be many, many things. It could be you're going to write a grant to acquire open space, or you're going to pursue funds to open a new theater in town, or it could be you could also write new regulations. Your land use regulations are an implementation step. And all of this flows from this whole planning process. And oftentimes, this process sort of goes around and around several times. As you try to implement something, you might realize you don't have enough information. You might need to go through the planning process again. But overall, this is kind of what the planning process is. And you can make it a lot more complex, but essentially that's what it is. And this is an important part of really the entire way of we try to accomplish local land use planning and regulation. And by and large, the courts will look at your regulations and see if it went through this kind of planning process. There was some sort of rational process that led to those regulations, and that they weren't just arbitrarily or capriciously, as the courts often say, derived just from out of thin air. So this planning process is important, and understanding how it works is also important. Now, the Planning Commission, again, through the enabling legislation, is you're allowed to have a Planning Commission. This is the exact part of the Connecticut General Statute, again, that CGS, that authorizes the creation of it. And the statutes provide that any municipality may, and the key word here is may, by ordinance create a planning commission, and that the planning commission has the powers expressly conferred upon them by the state. Okay, so this is the so-called enabling legislation. This is basically what it tells you. The municipalities can have planning commissions, and they can have certain powers. Now, the powers that are laid forth And this isn't the exhaustive list, by the way. This is kind of the key powers and duties. There's sort of a more exhaustive list. And if you go back and look at some of the fact sheets we have online, you can get those for each one of your commissions. But let's look at some of the key ones. The key is, number one, is to prepare, adopt, and or amend your plan of conservation and development. And this is part of that whole planning process. So this is a key document that the Planning Commission is responsible for. The plan of conservation and development is also called a master plan oftentimes, and it has to be renewed every 10 years. And this is again set forth by state statute. Another key power is that the Planning Commission has is to establish, change, or repeal the subdivision regulations. They also hear, consider, and decide upon applications for subdivision under this. And we'll talk more about this. But this is a really big power that the Planning Commissions have. Since this is a regulation, and so it really does affect local landowners, particularly local landowners who want to subdivide their property. So we'll look a little bit more in a few moments. Another power that municipalities have, which we won't talk about so much in this session, but just to make you aware of, is that they are allowed to review all proposed municipal improvements, and these are generally capital expenditures. So new roadways, new schools, any sort of large municipal improvement. The Planning Commission is allowed to comment on that, and the basis of all of the Planning Commission's review and comments are, if it's not under subdivision, then it's from the Plan of Conservation and Development. So the Plan of Conservation and Development is a key guide for you to do your reviews and provides guidance for that. So let's take a look at this first big power that and responsibility that the Planning Commission has, and that is, let's look at what a plan of conservation and development is. It's primarily a physical plan of the community. It looks at what is actually physically on the ground and how it's all arranged, what's going to happen, what activities are going to happen in the future. There are social and economic implications as well, and they're addressed usually in this plan. It's a long-range plan, usually covering a period of 10 or more years, oftentimes up to 20 years in the future. It's comprehensive, so it covers more than just a single part of town. It's looking at the whole town comprehensively and trying to see how different parts of the town will interact with each other. It's also a statement of policy goals, of policy and goals, and so it's actually telling the public what it is the community wants and what it's trying to achieve. And that's important, particularly if you're trying to make decisions that might be outside of your regulations. It does provide guidance for you to make decisions. And it's a guide not only to the Planning Commission, but also to other boards and commissions in local government, that allows it to sort of figure out what to do, particularly when you're in those gray areas where decisions aren't so black and white. There are some key sections of the Plan of Conservation and Development, this POCD, that's what that stands for. And these are just some of them that are in there. It's generally an inventory. We talked about that as part of the planning process. There's generally a section on housing, transportation, usually economic development, and then open space and natural resource protection and municipal improvement. So these are usually key sections that are addressed. So a plan is important. As we said, this generally is either updated or written every 10 years. But it shouldn't necessarily be just left for those 10-year periods. It should, the plan should be more or less a living document. And as situations change, which they oftentimes do, the plan should be reviewed, hopefully every year, and to see if the goals and objectives in the implementation plan that was set forth are still relevant, and that, or if you've fallen behind in a section or whatever. So the Planning Commission should be sort of constantly looking at this document and trying to make sure that it's still in use and being implemented. Okay, another key power and duty of the Planning Commission is the Subdivision Regulations, and this is one that's, I think, a lot of planning commissions spend a lot of time on, particularly in the past few years. It's spent quite a bit of time on. Let's just look at some of the definitions. Basic definition of subdivision is the division of a tract of land into smaller pieces or parcels. In Connecticut, we have a specific definition of subdivision, and that is that a piece of land must be split into 3 or more parcels with the express purpose of sale or building development. And this excludes development for municipal, conservation, or agricultural uses, and we'll look at that in a second. You can have both residential subdivisions. You can also have non-residential subdivisions. You can have an industrial subdivision or a commercial subdivision. But we generally think of subdivisions as houses, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just houses. Another element of subdivision regulations is that they must not be in conflict with the zoning ordinance, and we'll look at zoning obviously next or later in the zoning commission. But you don't want to come up with a situation where your subdivision regulations are in conflict with your zoning regulations. This makes it difficult for you as commissions to make decisions, but also leaves your applicants sort of betwixt and between. That's an important piece. So let's look at an example. This is, let's say we have a 100-acre farm here. Let's call this the Jones farm. And so this would be a single lot. Now let's say the Joneses just want to split off a piece of property for their daughter so that they can, so she can build a house. So they can split off an acre here, a 5-acre piece here, let's just say. And so they have a 5-acre piece, and then they have a 95-acre piece. Now, as we said in the definition, a subdivision is 3 or more acres. So 3 or more parcels. So this is really just 2 parcels. So this is considered what they call a free split. So this one they do not need free in that they don't have to come under the subdivision regulations. So you can get that split pretty much without coming to the Planning Commission for review. Now let's say the Joneses have a son and they decide to split off a 5-acre lot for him as well and for a home. This would in theory be lot 3. So this would be a point where what am I trying to say? Where they've crossed the threshold of 3 lots or more, and so now they would have to come under subdivision at this point. So with this split, the split for his son, the Jones farm family would have to go to the town's planning commission and apply under subdivision for the split. Now there is a little catch here, and that is if lot 1 here, the original Jones farm, is labeled agricultural land not for approved building lots, then that really, because of the definition of subdivision, agricultural lands don't fall under that. So really that would just be counted as 2 lots. In this case, the one for his son and daughter would be the 2 lots, and the other one is agricultural, so it doesn't really count. So that's one way that Farmer Jones could get by the subdivision regulations. However, if he has another son or daughter and they split off another piece, then he would hit that 3rd piece. A little complicated, a little subtlety there, but essentially, basic thing you need to know is 3 or more splits on a property, you go underneath the subdivision regulations. Now, why do we have subdivision regulations? There are a number of reasons. One is that they ensure that these subdivisions are properly designed, that we're not going to have lots that have no access out to a road or other things. That's landlocked lots. So that's important. It protects customers to make sure that you're getting an adequate piece of land that you can actually develop, that you're not paying for something that you can't do something with. It ensures and this is important certainly for the communities, it ensures the creation and preservation of an adequate land record, so you know where the lot lines are. So if there's future conflicts or disputes over boundary lines, you have a way of going back and looking at those. And then also it determines the primary proper layout of roads and capital improvements. So that's another big thing, where the sewer lines go, water lines, as well as roads and laying out roads. There's a lot of things that subdivision has sort of added on to its plate over the years, beyond just strict division of land, things like stormwater management, soil and erosion control, open space mandates, landscape and buffering, and on and on and on. There's lots of these things. So it is fairly complicated in that sense. Generally, when you get a subdivision application, you're going to get a lot of stuff. You're going to, and obviously there's an application fee. The applicant will submit an application, a written application, along with maps, so topographic maps, something showing soil suitability, engineered drawings of what they're proposing, as well as looking at inland wetlands and watercourse boundaries. Some of these things you would actually, in our Land Use Academy training, in our second session, we would look at some of these subdivision applications and how they're actually applied and how you would actually review them. So that's a key part of at the Land Use Academy that's worth going to check out. Now the approval process. So you get all this application, get all these materials. Essentially, once you have this is again where you are now in your administrative role as a commissioner. So you have to your basic job is to figure out if your application conforms with the subdivision regulations. And if it does, it has to be approved. It must be approved. If it doesn't, you should not approve it. So this is, again, sort of a little bit black and white. There's a lot of gray areas in there, but basic idea here is that when you're reviewing these applications, you have to just judge, does it meet our regulations or does it not? And go through each part of the application in that way. Now, commissions, and this is somewhat unique to planning commissions and subdivision, the commissions can waive certain sections of the subdivision regulations if they feel that special conditions exist. But it's key that whatever they're waiving isn't so egregious particularly to the plan and the general idea of the way the land's laid out. Now, the commission can't render, the planning commission generally cannot render a decision until it receives and considers the Inland Wetlands and Watercourse Commission's report. So generally that means that the Wetlands Commission will sort of have the first bite at this so that you can do it. However, interestingly, the Planning Commission isn't bound by it. So even though the Wetlands Commission may not grant a permit for whatever activity that might be in the application, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be bound by that decision in order to reach your decision.